Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to part 3 of Beyond Lands Behind Enchantment's Veil. The mist eventually dispersed into coiling white ribbons drifting on the water's surface. Then even these ribbons disappeared, and when the island had been was only empty sea. And the red-sided currach, her canvas billowing with fairy wind, sailed southward. Above her masts, the three birds flashed and tumbled and sang their dancing harmonies. In the boat, the men of Munster lay entranced. They awoke only when the singing ceased, and the birds had become three bright specks in the northern sky, heading for home. At once the currach grated on a beach, her sails slack. The travelers were at the edge of a narrow loch that pierced the shore of a harsh, pine-covered country. Across the waters of the loch were the ramparts of a wooden stronghold. From its tower hung the pennon of the pirate Cathman, abductor of Teague's wife and enslaver of his brothers. The Munstermen had arrived at the place of battle. Leaving his company to guard the currach, Teague armed himself and set out to reconnoiter. As he walked along the sand, he heard his name called softly across the water. A ragged ferryman, pulling hard at the oars of a shabby boat, approached and beached his craft. It was Teague's brother, Eogan, brought to this humble pass after a year of captivity under Cathman. Eogan's news was good. Teague's wife was safe, but a prisoner, and Cathman meant soon to take her for his own, having been delayed only by her pleading. Teague had arrived in a time of conspiracy, for two of Cathman's kinsmen were armed, and Eogan was, as well as Teague's brother, Ernalach, had joined them in secret. Eogan spent some time describing Cathman's defenses. Then he ferried Teague and his men to the opposite shore where Cathman's castle stood. Among the pine trees there, rebellious kinsmen of the pirate hid with their forces. Thus it came about that the Irish prince took his revenge on the outlander, not with a small force of 40 men, but with a company of 700. The warriors stormed the fortress that night, when Cathman and his men had drunk deep after their feasting. It was a savage battle, and in the end the Irish put the castle to the torch. Amid the flickering light of the flames and crowds of sweating, shouting men, Teague and Cathman fought alone, and the Munster man took blow after blow from the pirate until he was driven to his knees. He carried the fairy's emerald talisman, however, and it gave him the strength to rise once more and strike the enemy's head from his shoulders. Teague bore 30 wounds, but he did not die. His death came many years later, long after Teague and his wife and brothers had returned to Ireland. He lived in peace until the day that a white hart attacked him on the banks of the Boyne, and the maiden from the Enchanted Isle appeared before him once again, as she had promised years before. In none of their tellings of the venture could Teague or his men ever identify the point on the ocean where they had crossed the borders of their own world and entered the realm of fairy. They did not know the borders of the other world were ever shifting and transitory. It was significant, however, that the moment of crossing came when the currach was adrift, off course, and traveling in no direction that could be defined. It was significant, too, that the first event of the crossing was a sample of chaos in the shape of a storm. The fairy world was in some ways the antithesis of the world of mortals, and things of fairy had a natural affinity for the indeterminate and the undefinable. To relax the mortal grasp of order was to invite passage between the two worlds. In those days, despite the brave efforts of the human mind, the world was full of uncertainties. It was not just the unknown wilderness that frightened mortals, the uncharted seas that lapped the land, the looming mountains and the forest that encroached on field and village and castle. The natural world was dangerous enough, to be sure, but even greater uncertainties lay close at hand. Mortal time and mortal space were seamed with cracks that served as doorways to places where human rules were meaningless. It is not surprising, then, that mortals set great store by definition, because things could be easily understood in terms of what they were not. People thought about their world in terms of pairs and opposites. The seasons, for instance, were winter when nature slept, and summer when the earth bloomed. Correspondingly, the hours separated easily into dark night and bright day. But what of the times that were neither one thing nor its opposite, and thus free of the bonds of classification? What of dawn and dusk, which were neither night nor day? What of noon and midnight? What of the nights between the seasons, October 31st, or Samhain Eve, later called All Hallows Eve, and April 30th, Beltane Eve, later called May Day Eve? On those nights, the year's most mysterious and wonder-filled, all mortal rules were suspended, and chaos reigned. They were the times when passage between the mortal world and other worlds was most free. It was the same with space. Mortals liked to define it. They made countries and shires and townships and castle walls and farm fences, all in the interest of delineating the space they inhabited. The matter of boundaries was so important that throughout Europe, in a springtime ceremony called beating the bounds, all the known limits of local space were redefined. Sometimes by whipping the borders of property with hazel twigs, and sometimes by using the twigs on young boys as they were sent around the limits of a territory, thus passing on the knowledge of generations. But what of the dividing lines themselves? The streams that marked a territory, the shores of a sea, the verges of lakes, the fords of rivers, the crossroads, fences, walls, and thresholds. These, being neither one place nor another, served as portals to the world of fairy. So people were alert and careful at borderline times and places, knowing that strange encounters were possible. The spirit of the dead roamed free, for one thing. An Irishman who ventured out on the eves of Samhain or Beltane never looked behind him when he heard the sound of footsteps. Those were the footsteps of dead men, as he well knew. In Wales, it was said that a ghost sat on every stile. Stiles, sets of steps that allow people to climb over boundary fences where there is no gate, were in between or borderline places. Witches flew on the borderline nights, and the future was revealed. Those who waited on English church porches might hear a voice recite the names of all who would die in the coming year. On the nights before the seasons changed, the fairies traveled abroad, their power at its peak. The trooping fairies rode in festive processions known as fairy raids. Often their purpose was benevolent. Scotland's Sealy Court rode forth to bless the mortals' crops, it was said. An age would come when humans feared what fairies might do on these borderline nights. But before the races drew apart, people stole into the fields on festival eves in hopes of seeing fairies dance on the greensward and hearing their seductive music, or of watching a door open in a hillside to reveal the gleaming lights of the kingdom within, or of witnessing a splendid procession In those days, two people did not hesitate, as they later would, to venture on journeys that took them into unknown territories and across borders they might not even recognize. Teague's ocean voyage was a journey of that kind, and so was the venture of a Welsh lord named Pyle, who went on a hunt that changed his life. Pyle was Prince of Dyfed in the southwest of Wales. One day in autumn, when the air was crisp and cool, his thoughts turned to hunting. With his men and hounds, he headed through the forested hills toward a glen on the River Cook, where he had heard fine stags were to be found. The company rode all day to reach the region. That night they camped, and before the sun rose the next morning, Pyle roused the men and hounds for the hunt. With the hounds snuffling and dancing around the horses' hooves, the company set off into the depths of the forest. Just at first light, in a short time the hounds picked up a scent and charged off at great speed, baying and yelping as they tore through the underbrush. Pyle gave a shout and followed as close as he could, racing far ahead of his own men, heedless of the rough ground and the whipping branches. For a moment, the hounds disappeared from his view, but he soon caught up with them. They were clustered together and growling at the edge of a small clearing. Pyle reined in his lathered horse and took stock. In the clearing was a pack of strange hounds piled upon the twitching body of a stag they had just brought down. These were like no hounds Pyle had ever seen. They were glittering white, with ears and eyes of ruby red. He waited a moment, but no one was in sight, and the forest was silent. He had no idea where he was. With a shrug, he spurred his horse into the clearing, drove off the strange hounds, and set his own dogs to feeding on the body of the stag. After a few moments, he looked up to find himself observed with contempt by a tall man dressed in hunting clothes who sat astride a fine dappled horse. "I will not greet you, stranger," said this man. "It is a lout's discourtesy to take the prize of another man's kill." Pyle stiffened with chagrin. "What is your country, stranger?" he asked. "Anwen," said the gray-clad hunter. Anwen meant not world. Pyle now knew that somewhere, when he lost his way as he coursed the stag, or when he entered the clearing, he had crossed the border into fairy. "I am Aeron, king of Anwen," said the huntsman. Pyle said, "Only tell me how I may clear my honor with you, lord." "This way," said Aeron. "Go in my shape to Anwen and reign there in my place for a year and a day. You shall have all my powers during that time, and the dearest woman in the world to warm your bed. I will be in your shape in your own lands, ruling in your place. At the end of the year, you will fight my enemy for me. He is Havgen, whose lands march with my own and whose fights with me for them every year. If you fight successfully, I will meet you in this place once more." Pyle agreed, and the two rode together to the far edge of the clearing. Aeron pointed to where a palace glimmered in the distance. "This is my country," he said. As the mortal spurred his mount, the fairy king added, "If you would live, strike Havgen only one blow, and strike to kill. A second blow restores him." Then Aeron rode away, but before he entered the forest, he turned and raised his hand. Pyle gave a start, for the man who waved was himself. He looked at his hands on the reins. They were the narrow hands of Aaron. And thus concludes part 3. In our next video, we'll start where we left off in part 4. Thank you, boys and girls. Go out and have a great day.